Hi guys, back again, back in Romans chapter 2. We're going to look at verses 25 to 29 today. And I titled this, Who Are the True Jews? And I think it's very interesting and something that we should probably pay attention to. So this is one of the reasons I started this study. So let's get into it. So Paul has just finished telling his readers in Rome that no one has any excuse to deny God's existence, his righteous character, or to pass judgment on one another. Those are the things that he says you have no excuse. So now he goes into a long discourse on God's law. So when Paul writes about the law, he's talking about Mosaic law. The 10 Commandments. We all know those, right? Hopefully. The basic standards given by God to people to live by, right? So what does he say of the law? And remember now, he's writing to a church in Rome. He was a religious Jew before becoming a Christian. But there are both Jews and Gentiles in this church and surrounding. But it was primarily Gentile. So what does he say to them? Paul begins by saying there are two groups, essentially the same two groups within his church that he's now writing to, and the only two groups that exist on earth, really, to this day, if you're thinking in terms of Christianity. So they are the Jews and the Gentiles, the Jews and the non-Jews, okay? So, and you have to understand the background. The Jews in Judeo-Christian teaching, the Jews were God's chosen people all down through the ages. Like, even before they had the written law with Moses, God chose Abraham and said, you're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky as far as your descendants go. And, you know, Jesus came through that line. So the Jews were God's chosen people. Everyone outside of that chosen people, they were Gentiles. They were not included in the laws that God gave, or at least they didn't receive them because they weren't part of the Jews or the Jewish religion. Right? So this is who he's talking to, both Jews and Gentiles, and he's talking to them about the law that was given to the Jews in the Old Testament. These are those who have the law and those who do not have the law or didn't in writing. Okay? Does that make sense, right? So the Jews were given the law through Moses, as we know, on the tablets back in Exodus. That was a long time before this, right? Thousands of years. The Gentiles, or those outside the Jewish faith, many of which are now in the church that Paul is writing to as believers in Christ, they had not been given this law. They had not been given the written law. So, as he speaks of the law, he speaks of the haves and the have-nots. But what does he say? It's very interesting, okay? And it just lines up with what he's just told everyone about not having an excuse. When you look out the window, when you see God's creation, you know that he is, right? He's going to say something similar about the law. So, and you have to remember, before the law was given through Moses, all the time before that, from Abraham to Moses, and even prior to that, with Adam and Eve, all the way going back, there was no written law, okay? So keep that in mind. But here's what he says. He says, if you sin without the law, meaning you don't have it in front of you, nobody ever gave you a Bible, or in this case, you never saw those tablets, you never had a prophet tell you or teach you, you were a Gentile, you were outside the Jewish faith. If you sin without the law, you don't have it in front of you, you die without the law. And if you sin with the law, then you die with the law. So Paul points out that it is not the people who hear the law, know the law, have the law, who are righteous before God. Rather, those that do it. Well, how can you do it if you don't have it? Well, isn't it interesting? This is what he says. He adds that when those who are without the law, never been taught, never been given any of these religious advantages, let's call them, when the Gentiles who are without the law do what it requires, they live in such a way that they prove that God exists through their actions. They show, Paul says, that God's law is written on their hearts. So this is what he has just got done saying in Romans 1. You have no excuse. It's in there, guys. It's when God made up the batter to make humans, it's in there. God's law is in here. And if you ignore it, if you deny it, if you say it's not real and he doesn't exist, you are the one in denial. You are the one deceiving yourself and living in a false reality. Okay, so that's his point here. But he says that when these Gentiles who have not been given the law do the law, it's counted to them as righteousness, right? It's written on their hearts. He says their conscience bears a witness to them, and their own thoughts will accuse or excuse them according to the gospel in the final judgment. Okay, so we know it. It's in there. God put it in there. But what of those who had the law from the beginning, right? The Jews. He talks about those who had the law from the beginning and who use it to throw their knowledge and their weight around, boasting of their religious privilege, telling everyone else what to do, teaching everyone else what to do and not to do, and yet they themselves are failing to do what it says, right? What of they who teach and preach the law, yet do all that their own teachings condemn? Paul says, if you are a Jew who takes pride in telling others not to steal or cheat, commit adultery, worship idols, yet you're doing those things, your religion is of no advantage, is irrelevant. Okay? So the Gentiles who have none of the advantage are actually true Jews. And you who are called Jews and look to be Jews outwardly are false Jews. Read this passage, guys. It's important. And he would know, wouldn't he? Paul, he was the guy who relied on his religious position while doing evil to the very Gentile believers that he is now writing to and calling true Jews. He was at the height of religious status, right? He was trying to murder Christians in the beginning, but he does a 180 and he changes into a true Jew. He was an outward Jew in the beginning when he was murdering Christians, but then when he repents and believes in Jesus Christ, he becomes a true Jew. That is what he is describing here in Romans 2, and it's very interesting, especially for us today, I think. But Paul discusses this in a way that they'll understand, because Jews and anyone who is religious, they have a lot of symbols, they have a lot of things that they use to remind them of God and of God's law and God's ways. And so what does he bring up here when he's trying to explain this matter to them? He talks about circumcision. Some people might think that's weird, but you have to understand what circumcision was for the Jews. Paul equates circumcision to regeneration, or being born again in Christ. And why does he do that? Because circumcision is an outward sign of a change, okay? So Paul says if you're circumcised, which meant back then in the Jewish tradition, it meant that you were included in the family of God. It was, you had to do this with your child, right? Your boy child. and that you were following Jewish law. And if you failed to obey God's law, though, in your heart and in your deeds, that outward sign that was so important, that was, you had to do this, was part of their, they had to do this. It was part of the law that God gave them. If you fail to obey God's law in your heart and in your deeds in your life, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. How could that be, right? You can't undo that, but that's what he says. And what does he mean? He goes on, though, he says, not only that, but if one is uncircumcised and he hasn't done that ritual, he hasn't followed that law, he's a Gentile, but yet he keeps the law in his heart, in his deeds, in his faith, it is as though he is circumcised. What does he mean? What are you talking about, right? That's crazy. But it makes perfect sense, because he means that external validation, whether it be physical, ethnic, familial, or religious, or anything else, it means nothing. All those outward things mean nothing without obedience, okay? So they who are in the fold of God are not there by name or number, okay? They are there by faith and by deed. So he means circumcision itself is merely a sign and symbol shadowing the New Testament regenerate heart that comes with being born again into Christ. Okay, that was pointing us to a regenerate heart. Okay, so doesn't matter what your title is, Jew, Gentile, rabbi, laborer, peasant, beggar, God only looks at your heart. There's no favoritism for any person. Okay, so consider his words. We need to read this because it's rich. Beginning in Romans 2, verse 25. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have written the code in circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. So what's he saying? He's like, these guys who didn't, like, first of all, you do have an advantage. You have all of this in front of you guys. He's talking to the Jews. You have this advantage, this religious advantage. And it is worth something if you follow and abide by it. But if you